Good morning. How's everybody today? It is Thursday, but I've got work to do. So I thought, why not bring everybody along with me? So I got to design an API. And the API that we're going to design is for the authorization system that we're building for B2C. So the back end is all done in the sense of the runtime stuff, right? So the runtime's ready. So that when you run and when you sign in, you're going to get app roles pushed into your tokens, and then you'll be able to get them in your apps, which is super cool. However, what I don't have yet is the admin interface. So let's get this set up here. So this is what we got to build. I don't know why GitHub does this. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. Like, it's right here. Why can't I just see the whole thing? But actually, it's good because, well, maybe it's not so good. So we've got this, right? This is going to be our thing. And so we've got this graph proxy, and it's going to go and take app roles out of graph and go push them into B2C tokens as they come in. And that's all well and good. The other side, though, is the admin side of actually getting the users into those app roles in the first place. So if you've played this game before and you're familiar with B2C, Azure AD B2C doesn't have any app role support, so you can't use app roles. You can put people in them, but you never get them back in the token, which is what we have to do over here on the left, which is say, hey, let's go get all the stuff and push them into the token. The thing of getting people into those, it gets a little bit more complex with B2C because not necessarily everybody should be able to go and do that. And the data that comes back should probably be scoped, right? So you can think of the scenario as I'm building some SaaS or whatever. I'm building some app that I'm going to sell. I want people to be able to sign in, and I want their administrators of their organizations to be able to go and clean them up, right? To be able to go do the assignments, to see who's in what roles, to create new roles perhaps. And the problem we run into is that it's really easy to do that with Azure AD and multi-tenancy. Because with multi-tenancy and Azure AD, a user upstream, a user that's using Azure AD to sign in, their administrators can choose who they are, and their administrators only see users in their organization. So it's great, because if you're a SaaS builder, you don't have to go and worry about building an entire authorization system straight out of the box. The problem with that method is that not everybody has Azure AD. Not everybody's a Microsoft customer. As sad as that makes me, not everybody is. And thus, we still have to deal with these users who are not Microsoft customers, but are customers of your app, right? So because of that, in B2C, we can pass through roles that come up from upstream Azure AD users. So an Azure AD user that signs in, no sweat. We'll pass through the roles. Their administrators have assigned them. They've put policies on. They've done whatever, right? For these other users who sign in with a social account or you create a new username and password or whatever, we need a way to do roles for them. So you can do it on your own. You do, build it on your own. And have your own database that is configured to, your apps can call it. You can let B2C call that API and get the role data back or whatever. But that seems duplicative if we've already got most of the plumbing available via Azure AD. And since B2C lives on top of Azure AD, there's a bunch of authorization stuff like app roles that live underneath that. So we might as well get an opportunity to use it. So that's what we're going to do. So the first half of this is the runtime stuff. I sign in, I go and query the roles out of the graph, and we push the roles into the token. So to the downstream application, it doesn't know anything about how that happened. All it knows is it gets an ID token or an access token, and that token has roles in it. And so things like ASP.NET authorization just work, right? So if you're using like the authorized tag in a controller, that all just works. So until we get to the point where there are app roles in B2C, we need something. Like I've got a customer that needs something like this, and since we announced that we were going to start working on this, a bunch of people have pinged us and said, hey, we really need this too. So I'm glad that we've decided to spend a little time and make this work. So so far, and this is all open source. It's all out on GitHub and it's all MIT. So feel free to go out there and contribute if you'd like. But feel free to go and use it once it's ready. So if I look at the code, we'll look at the code briefly. There are two functions in here, two Azure functions. One is the admin function, and the admin function is the thing that's going and dealing with what we're going to work on today. The other one is the runtime function. And the runtime function is the thing that's going to go, when a user signs in, go query. It's the thing that's going to go query the graph to go get these users' app roles and stuff them in. So this is already done and this works. So we know that this works. It's just a bunch of, hey, go get this, then go get this, then go get this. The advantage, however, is that this only adds about 140, 160 milliseconds to every call, to every sign-in call, which isn't great, but it's at least acceptable for today. And there are certain things we can do to kind of get that down. Like we might look at doing some caching or whatever. Currently, we're going to the graph through a function. And the reason for that is I cannot get the b2c JSON transformations. I can't get them just right to fully parse, especially arrays that come back from graph directly. So ideally, we would just do this directly in b2c and let b2c talk to graph without this proxy function, but we're going to have one. So because we got one, we have to deal with it, and it is what it is. The one problem here is that now this function needs to be as available as Azure AD. And we're still going to have some composite availability here. So our compounded availability is going to be whatever our function is combined with whatever our B2C uptime is going to be. Also combined with Graph. I mean, Graph and Azure AD, if one of them goes down, they tend to all sort of fall over together, but there's always a possibility that you'll be able to sign in, but maybe Graph specifically, the Graph API itself, isn't necessarily available. So those three components are the things that we have to calculate our composite availability based on those three, as opposed to just one or two, which is what we'd be able to do if we were doing this directly in B2C. So the runtime function's already done, and now I'm at the point where I got to build a UI. And the UI has a couple of extra rules that need to happen. So that's over here, right? So over here on the right, we've got this administrative portal. And it's going to be the thing that's got to handle getting users in to the app roles and defining app roles. So you can do this in the administrative UI today. You can go create app roles all day if you're an administrator, but it's not finely grained enough to be able to say, well, you're just an administrator of this app, so you can go and add app roles. It's also not finely grained enough to say user 123 is a member of org ABC and thus should only be able to create and assign roles from people in org ABC. So we have a couple things we have to deal with. First, we need to mark somebody's organizations. So we need to have a place where we can store somebody's organizations, which we'll do on their user object. We've got to store the organization data itself, like the organization metadata somewhere. That's probably going to be about the only external data source that we have if I've played my cards correctly. And then we need to allow a user, an organizational user, to come in and say, hey, I need to create a new role. I need to assign users to that role, which means I need to search for users who are in my organization and my organization only. And so that extra filtering that we have to do is to say, give me all the users where organization equals ABC. That's why we can't go to Graph directly, besides the fact that it's B2C and a B2C user can't go to Graph directly. But because of that, our function is going to have to run in this elevated app context. So the function itself is going to be client credentials. It's just going to be straight up, app username and password, access to everything kind of a thing. Kind of like a service account that talks to SQL. And the function is going to be where the function is a key responsibility to say, this user can or cannot do this, or we're going to filter out this data based on the user's organization or, whatever, right? So I've had a couple ideas about this, but I wanted some opinions, which is why I decided to jump on here this morning. And if there's anything that this group has shown us, it's that everybody has plenty of opinions. So I thought, why not get some ideas from the people who ultimately need this and need to use it. So I had a couple ideas for how to do this. The first thing I thought was, well, we're using Graph. And because we're using Graph, let's just mimic the Graph API as closely as possible. And in fact, at one point I thought, well, why don't we put API management, like an API management type proxy in Azure APIM, Apigee, whatever. Why don't we put that in front of in front of the graph and publish the graph API through our own APIM, and that way our APIM could use client credentials to make these elevated calls. But I don't feel like trying to express all of that in APIM policy, and as Bolt correctly states, APIM is going to be a lot of extra money. Now, if you look at an app that's getting, millions of logins per day, your function cost may start to climb. But even then, the functions premium with a consumption on a non-consumption plan or an app service plan, I mean, those start at like 40, 50, 60 bucks a month, which is going to be way cheaper than like a proper multi-headed, multi-node APIM, especially distributed across multiple regions. So, and for us, we're going to deploy our function to multiple regions. So these functions are going to largely be stateless, which will be great because that way we don't have to worry about any sort of state management that happens. We're going to deploy our functions into multiple regions. We could do an API app service too, Bolt. That's fine. In fact, that was one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit today too, which was how do we design this API in a way that we can put it in an API app service. We could run it on our own server. We could run it in functions. We could run it here. We could run it there. Doesn't really matter. You can run it in a container if you want. So anyway, what I've got so far in terms of the function itself, right? Let me get some of this other stuff out of the way. Like this is one of the things that I don't want to say regretting, but one of the things that I'm just like really kind of burnt out about is creating all these new entities. And at first I thought, well, why don't we just pass through the graph entities? We'll just use graph entities directly because we've got a graph SDK and somebody's already done all that work. And since we're manipulating graph, let's just use those. But then I started thinking, well, what if somebody don't want to use graph? What if they want to go build their own? They want to go build their own repository with SQL or Cosmos or TableStore or whatever, right? So it's kind of like, well, we've got this organization thing that we have to figure out. And so why don't we, I guess at some point we're ultimately going to have to build our own entities. So I don't really want to build our own entities, but I have a suspicion that that's inevitably every time I've taken a dependency on somebody else's entities, I've always ended up being like, well, I should have done this in the first place. I should have gone and built my own. And at least this way we have an API surface that's consistent. And if graph is the repository today, which it will be, and if tomorrow the repository is SQL or tomorrow the repository is, Mongo or whatever, because that's what your business needs, at least that API surface doesn't have to change. And because the primary consumer of this is going to just be like a React front end or some kind of front end, which is still TBD, open to suggestions on what that front end should be, I feel like if I don't rebuild entities, I'll end up regretting it. Blazor Wasm, that'd be great too. It's a great idea too. So anyway, the interface I've got for let me just look at the functions that we've got already. So my thought here is that while I don't want to necessarily mimic graph, I'd like to have like a higher order, or what's it called, the Richardson maturity model. I'd like to have a higher maturity API up front. So use the verbs. I don't know if we're necessarily going to get to like level 3 with hypermedia in the responses because I don't necessarily know that we're going to need that up front, but at least it's an option if we want it. So instead, I've just got right now sort of the basics, and I'm looking at an API structure that sort of is similar to graph, but also fairly generic, right? Get your organizations, and all of these would be filtered by who you are, right? So limited by default to the user scope, because getting into a position where a user has to know their organization ID up front, for example, like unless you're a member of multiple organizations, I just can't like, that just seems like a bunch of extra verbosity that's just not necessary, right? Because every user who comes to this portal or comes to this mobile app or whatever the front end client ends up being, it's always going to be restricted to what organizations they're a member of. And they could just be a member of every organization, or they could be some sort of super admin. But I would almost think that these super admin types would almost have like a separate endpoint that they would use, or some way to indicate that they are, a super admin, and thus, the filter essentially turns off. I was looking at function invocation filters because what I'd really like to do is be able to say something like this, where like I have like a route attribute up here and say, like I've got a route, and then my route is, orgs, and that's like my base path, and then everything here, I could just do like, this route would be blank, this route would not be, but I can't seem to do that. So that doesn't seem to work. I don't know if it's a web API thing, if it's a functions thing, or what, but I can't seem to set like a base path for an overall class and then have relative paths in the roots. So instead, right now, I've got super verbose roots. And then Bolt says that he is in the middle of building a response-based class that builds those links. So that's cool. I'd love to see that. And oh yeah, and that's true, right? Like he says that this could also be used as sort of an alternate admin portal for something like Azure AD, which actually a thing I didn't think about. That's pretty cool. Like, because depending on what kind of app you're building, there would certainly be a case where you either want to manipulate the Azure AD roles based on some sort of arbitrary filter like an organization, because I mean ultimately it's criteria. So you would have being able to do that in Azure AD directly, would not b2c, would actually be kind of cool, because you can't do that in Azure AD today either. You can't just filter on an arbitrary property and say only let this user see these other users, right? So especially with things like B2B, like if I've got a big B2B deployment or something where I've got a bunch of guests in my directory, letting an administrator do delegated admin, I mean, on the surface it sounds like B2B abuse, but my suspicion is that over time, because you already see things like external identities in regular Azure AD, my suspicion would be that over time, as things get closer together and have more feature parity, that having an alternate interface for dealing with app roles and assignments would actually be pretty cool. So I've got something else I've been working on too, but we won't get into that today. But it's kind of like an alternate administrative experience for excuse me. It's an alternate administrative experience for certain Azure AD tasks, and I think it's gonna be a lot of fun. Yeah, and then versioning. I was thinking about what to do about versioning, because I didn't really want to put a version in these roots. I was actually thinking I could manipulate that in the host, depending on so essentially the branch would match to the host, right? And so if my host, for example, if we have a route prefix of say v1, because that's of course that's what this one's going to be. If we have a v1 root here, or v1 root prefix here, as we version, we could just change these. Although I don't know if we'll necessarily get to the level of that. Might be too coarse to say this entire function with all of these individual functions in it. This entire function app is only going to be v1. And I feel like there's got to be stuff out there that does that. I don't know. Everything I've seen is either like tries to do literally everything for you, or just ends up being a bunch of individual pieces. So this may be too coarse for the moment. But at the same time, too, we may end up in a place where I wonder if we end up in a place where can I use that attribute on can I use that attribute in an Azure function, or do I have to be doing like web API? Did I get API version here to be able to do it? I mean, most of the stuff in web API should work in functions. I just don't know. Let's see. So anyway, let me go look at this. So web API version attribute in Azure functions, or maybe let's just see versioning Azure functions. See if anybody else has solved this problem or not yet. Just durable versioning, how to target runtime versions. That doesn't matter. Let's see. Let's see what we get out of Medium today. So Request header, we don't want to do that. URL or query string. I don't know if we really want to do query string. I kind of find query strings to be somewhat ugly and non-discoverable. So I wonder if, I guess URL probably is the base. It probably is the best place to do it. So, yeah. So, this is just HTTP trigger attribute, just literally putting v1 in there. I guess function proxies would be an option too. Instead of having to go full API management, we do something like a function proxy. And the function proxy would be the surface, and the functions themselves would be, the URLs would largely be immaterial, right? So then do you end up in a place where you have an API v1, like this guy has API v1 and API v2? Like that feels very icky and verbose. I guess then it comes down to like how long do we want to maintain these versions? Because this is ultimately something that the point of this project is that you take this and you run it yourself. As opposed, like it's not going to be like a SaaS authorization. I guess I should say that this isn't going to be like authorization as a service that you can just go turn up. I mean, I guess it could be if you were feeling optimistic and you didn't think your customers would mind putting their authorization data in your service. But at least the intention for V1 is to be just something that you download, deploy, extend, turn into your own kind of a thing, right? So I guess that's one way. We could do it this way, although I don't really like that way. That feels exceedingly verbose and just feels like I'd end up with like absolutely massive functions. But at least it does give me versioning per. I was thinking more about customers who want to use the API and switch between graph versions. Oh, that's an interesting thing. I had not thought about that. So if I could do this directly to graph, because the bulk of the reason why we're doing this is because we cannot go to graph directly as a B2C user. So that's problem number one. And problem number two is maybe it's 1A or 1B. The second half of that problem is that because a B2C user can't go directly, we have to use this like privileged account. So the privileged account can do anything in the B2C directory. And so that the thing that's using that privileged account, which right now at least is slated to be a function, that thing is what ultimately does filtering and figures out whatever and actually makes the backend graph calls. But that would also mean that you're going to be pinned to a specific specific graph version, because we're going to stick to graph 1.0 or whatever for today, just so it's sort of production ready. But eventually there will be another graph V, or you could say there's new functionality that's only in the beta endpoint of graph, and so maybe that's the way to start. Is we end up with two that mirror the graph API versions of just a V1, a V1.0, and a V1.0 and a beta. The other thing I've been wondering is how far away from the graph do we want to get? Like, does this end up being like a completely brand new, net new type of a thing where this whole thing is done? Or would we like to, the closer we stick to the graph, the closer you could do this with a delegated permission in the future when that becomes available. And you could just dump the function entirely. Are we proxying solely for the purposes of changing the security context? I mean, that's 90% of the reason, but but by changing the security context, the last 10% is really the custom stuff that we have to do. Because that last 10% is the stuff that's going to filter the users based on who you are and what organization you're in. So we really want to take this graph, really want to take graph as it is and introduce an organizational concept. Although graph already has an organization construct, and it's not visible to you. So like you don't see the fact that you're in organization ABC. If we go look at the graph calls that we have to make, like if I go to graph, which is ak.ms/GE, if we go look at the graph, when I get signed in here, if I go to me, for example, well, me, I don't say my organization in here. My organization is implied by the fact that I signed in to organization ABC. It also means that when I do things like applications, or like if I was to do, well, I'll just do applications. If I did something like this, applications is still within the context of my, organization. So to the graph consumer, organization is largely, they never know anything about their org. They don't do anything about their organization. It's just implied by who they are. And if the goal in the future is to just do this all directly, then maybe mapping close, maybe following that same pattern is the way to go. Because then you're essentially swapping an endpoint, right? You switch from myfunc.azurewebsites.net, you switch from that to graph.microsoft.com, your security context changes and everything, quote, just works, right? We don't actually have to go and change any sort of, we don't have to do any proxies, we don't have to do any extra work. All we do is swap out our endpoint. All the paths are still the same. So maybe that is the best thing to do, because then that gives us a path to graph later on. And it means that if you wanted to build your own without graph, if you wanted to build your own sort of repository for this sort of stuff without graph, your URIs would still match graph. They would just be fulfilled by a different backing store. I did follow that model in the runtime function because I wanted to be, the runtime function in my mind is temporary. So I think that might actually be pretty cool, because then we're literally going to mirror the graph, and we're going to have the extra organizational stuff handled, because the organization in this case doesn't directly correlate to the directory. In normal graph, your organization correlates to your directory because you're in a directory context. But in our case, in B2C, many users from many different organizations would be a part of that context, would be a part of different organizations, all within the same directory context. So that would mean your ability to filter based on org now becomes an additional property that we have to filter on, as opposed to something the user has to do. So in that case, I think that makes it, I think we may end up with 2 extra endpoints for like get organization, although isn't there an organizations endpoint on here in graph? I think there is. Maybe it's just, but it really wouldn't show you organizations that you are a member of per se, right? So this is just the sort of top level directory. You can almost think of this as the directory. What is the directory that I'm a member of? But we could still follow this and just, it is an array. So I suppose we could just follow the same thing, and what we would send back would just be an array of organizations that you're a member of, as opposed to the one directory that that your context is in for the moment, which is what organization is. So what that would give us, so I'm gonna put it in the host. I'm just gonna do a v1 here, v1.o here, to map to graph. Maps to graph. Okay, I can't put comments in. Here. That would be too easy. It'd make too much sense. So that's the organization endpoint. So really, then what this becomes is organization. And even though we are actually going to return a plural of this, that's ultimately what it's going to be. And it would only be, I guess it would only be a get. Although you could invite a user. But the invitation is going to happen in a way where the user is going to accept the invitation and have their organization tagged onto them. So I don't actually, I think we're going to let b2c do most of that work. I have invitations in spec or in scope for this, but I haven't gone and dug into them yet. But ideally, I think we could do that with like an IT or with an ID token hint and send that in when the user is going through registration. So this one won't be a direct proxy, not a direct proxy, but will return the user's b2c organizations. And then get organization, that's probably, I mean, honestly, I don't even know if we're going to really even need that to get a single organization. Because why would you need to get a single organization? I guess we could keep it for now just in case. Organization and then an organization ID. I don't know if we were to put this ID in here in graph, would we get this specific one? Organization. We do. So we'll keep that since that's the same. So this is not a direct proxy. I'm almost wondering if there's like an attribute we put on some of these that say, hey, these are just direct proxies, and then we filter the responses back when they come back. So then get organization users, instead of doing orgs organization, we'll just do users, because that's essentially what we're going to do, right? We're filtering everything down to the organization of the caller anyway. So that's going to mean get users within the org, which also means we need to know the user's org to filter the query. But ultimately, it's going to be a pass-through to graph. And then same with getting a specific user. And so that's going to, we'll just take out the organization ID. Now, what I've got here, let me make this, I'll put this on another line. So for the root here, we don't need orgs or organization ID. We do need users. So then for user ID, this is like a GUID essentially. So the user ID here is just going to be, it's just a regex on the root template. So the regex root template just says, hey, give me a GUID. And I did not write this regex, because if anybody who's watched the show knows that regexes make my eyes bleed. I did not write this regex. Luckily, I found it out on the internet, so I hope that it might be a GUID. Well, so that's the thing. These are user objects, right? These are Azure, or these are B2C user objects. How would their object ID, not necessarily their subject ID, at what point would their user ID not be a GUID? Because we do have the option in regular graph when we go get a user. We do have the option for users, and then we have something like I can put in my email address, right? Or my UPN, and I get my user object back, and I can also put in my object ID and get back the same thing. So essentially what I have here, one root that's specific to user ID, and then the other root is specific to, is a regex for email. And it's an incredibly basic email regex, so don't judge me. But yes, so what does graph do when it's not a GUID? So if I was to send this thing an object ID that was not a GUID, so what it does do right now is if I just send it like this, like just my alias without the end, so it says that resource doesn't exist. So I have to give it my fully qualified UPN. And I don't think I can do this without any kind of without anything like that. Like if I tried to give it my Sam account name, for example, yeah, like that's, I'm not sure the best way to escape that. But we can always go look at the doc too and see what the user's thing is. So a link to the docs for this one would be good. So if you ask for GUID and the func, it'll 400. Oh, you mean that? Well, so I've got two roots. I've got one regex for the ID, and I've got one regex here for. So, but this is going to 400. Well, no, because it'll 404 if it doesn't match these regexes. So, like, I'll just run it. We'll take a look. If it doesn't match one of these roots for users, it sends back a 404. So, like, let me put this over here. I will put this right here. So let's see, where is, here we go. So if I run our function, which should be running, it would help if I had the function keys lit up. Oh, I need to get my Azure storage started up. Storage emulator for the function. Okay, storage emulator's running. So I'll zoom this in over here a little bit. Can I make this go away? Can I close this or collapse it or something? There we go. So if we go look at this query, so I'll just do users with a thing. Good morning, Sean. So if I go look at users here, so if I run this one with a GUID, wait, oh no, I want to run it. I don't want to save it. So if I run this one with the GUID, so that's a get. If I run this one with the GUID, users, user ID regex, and I've got the GUID here, that should run this regex over here. So that should match the user ID regex. So that's users, wait, I need the v1 in here. So v1.0/users whack user GUID. Okay, so we run that, and I just have a message in here that just says GUID. So it just sends back the fact that it matched this GUID root. Okay. Excuse me. So we hit the GUID root with a GUID. Now if I was to put like, some email address in here, we should hit the email root, which, oh wait a minute, did I not update that one yet? No, I did. Users, blah, 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 blah. Oh, I don't have an organization ID anymore. Let's get rid of this. So the only thing that's really going to be in here is user email. So we've got that. We've got user email. Cool. Let me rerun this. Man, everything's so big, I can't find any of my stuff. All right. Okay. So run this again. So now if I run this, if we execute this against it, we should hit the email endpoint. Make sure these all look good. So there are our functions, get user by email. Okay, cool. So users whack user or email address. So this hits our email one. And then if I just send in something that doesn't match either one of those, I believe we'll get a 404. And we do. So we get a 404. And that 404 would mimic the graph. Well, no, actually, it doesn't mimic the graph, does it? So if I send this thing in like junk, it gives me back, oh no, it does give me a 404. Okay, so yeah, so we get a 404 if we send in something, or if we send in a user that doesn't exist. Should also get a 404, cool, okay. So in terms of users, I can get a user list, or I can get a specific user, and I can get a specific user by ID, by their object ID, or by their user ID, or sorry, their email address. I guess there is also the case where somebody would use username in Azure or in b2c. And that may end up being a problem because a username isn't going to have, is not going to have is not going to match an email regex. Or telephone, that's true. That is true. However, I guess, yeah, because you would be in a place where the only potential thing would be an email address, a username, or a phone number. So I guess my regexes are just not going to work. I mean, they work in the sense, but they're just going to be too specific. Like, we're still going to have something. And so instead of matching on the regex to try to match email, to try to match a user ID, maybe instead, I don't know, maybe instead we either have an extra one, Or we just have to dump that entirely anyway. And just, search for it and return 404. So let's see here. Let's get this closed. So we'll close our function here. So that would mean figure out what to do with phone number and username. Because those are going to be in different fields anyway, right? Email gets stored in the same field as username. Yep, that's correct. Because it's not technically an email. It just happens to be there. It's like the sign-in name, I think. Well, I guess we could use these at least to have sort of one check that happens before it even comes in. So we just end up with, a couple of extra ones and then one that sort of catches all. Although I don't think that it'll go to the most specific one first. Like if we were to take the same thing here, if I took this and just had like get organization user and I took out this regex, user query or whatever. If we took this out, I don't think it's going to do a catch-all. I don't think it's going to catch all per se. I think it's going to be get organization user by whatever. We'll call it that. My worry is it's not going to. It's going to match that. It's going to match that one first. What's my error? What doesn't it like? Let's see. Is there actual errors or are these just? I'll just do a build on this. I did change it. Oh, you're right. I did not change it. Get organization user by whatever. Whatever. Okay. Good catch. Okay. Come on. There we go. All right. All right. Well, didn't like something. Oh, those are my app role things. Okay, those don't matter. So we've got get organization user, get organization user. So we've got the user one, which is by ID. We've got by email, and then we've got by whatever. So let me take this one. And I'm pretty sure this is the thing that's going to get hit all the time. So I'll run one with an email address. And we'll see that goes to. So that did work. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Should be fine because it didn't work the other day, and I was really annoyed by it. So now I'm glad that maybe it will actually work correctly or as expected. History. So let's do this one. We'll run this one again. This one is our GUID. So that still matches the GUID. So then if I just put in like goop, that hits everything else. So we could do that. Or I could have one for phone number. We could do a phone number regex, but some of the email regexes I saw were 9,000 characters long, which is why I ended up with the short one because I couldn't get the other one to work. So just because it was too long and like trying to figure out what to escape and what could be escaped and what couldn't be was just such a nightmare. So maybe then, because phone number is admittedly quite sort of less in terms of usage, at least right now, maybe we'll just let this one hit. So this is the catch-all for phone number and user and username, not email. Okay, so we've got those. So this way, if I took these same queries and I swapped these for graph, then those queries would work or would mimic how graph is working. So we get 404s if they're not there. Of course, we'd have to send back a 404 if we don't find the user in the directory. And yeah, I guess the one thing we are going to lose is we don't get the automatic. We don't get an automatic 404 if they send something that doesn't match the regex, but that's just because we've got two regexes and one catch-all. So, okay, so we've got our organization, or we've got our users, and so really, well, I guess what this really ends up becoming is this is really all about users. Now, there was one thing. There's one thing I was looking at. I thought was kind of neat. We need to assign. We're going to have to assign users to these app roles, and there are a couple different ways to do app role assignment. So we've got, in order to do an app role assignment, let me get the stuff out of the way here. When we do an app role assignment, this is organization, and then we have users. These are all going to be filtered. So users, user ID, user email, get by whatever. Cool, okay. We'll obviously have to clean these all quite a bit. So if I'm an administrator, I'm going to come in to our admin portal over here, right? I'm going to come into our admin portal, and I'm going to be able to, I'm going to see the applications that my org is using. I'm going to see the users that are in my organization. Maybe not even necessarily see the users per se, but I will see the apps for which I am an administrator. So we're going to have to do a get applications list that's filtered too. So we're going to see the apps for which I am an administrator. And administrator in this case means in a specific role for that application. I'm going to have to add new roles themselves. So add an app role. And then I'll need to search my organization, right, for a specific user or group, and then do an assignment based on that. So we'll need to be able to search for apps, search for users in my org, search for my app, search for users, and then do assignments. Or then create app roles and then do assignments into them. So if we look at the graph today for applications, that's a top level entity called applications. So I really think this should kind of follow what we did with users. So the users are going to be filtered to a specific organization, and the applications are going to be too. So we still end up with a top level thing called applications. Although when we do an app role assignment, that's actually done on the users themselves. So like if I get mine up here, if I look at my app role assignments, users. Oh yeah, I'm not trying to do a post. That's a good point. Users, app role assignment. So this actually hangs off of me as the user, right? And then of course you see like you'll have things like the principal ID, which is me, but then you also have the resource ID. Now in Graph, you can do this one of two different ways. You could also say, hey, I am application 123. Give me all of the things that are assigned to this. I know, it makes me cringe too, Bolt, but I think it's because you really would never have more than one organization in Graph, because the organization is the directory. I mean, maybe you would. It is an array, so somebody's thinking ahead. But I don't think, organizations does not work, sadly. But it is an array. So if I like collapse this value, what do I get? No, there's just the one. It's a big one too. Goodness. Okay. So applications. We can do an application, and then I believe it's we have to get a specific application, which we'll do. I'll just choose. I don't know. I'll just choose one of these. Whatever. We choose a specific one, and then I believe it is app role assigned to, or maybe it is still app role assignments. That doesn't exist. Okay. I'll just go get a different one then. I used the wrong ID. Applications. So we'll just go get an ID here. We'll go get a specific one. And then I believe the path that hangs off of this is, I believe it's app role assigned to. Is that what it is? No, there is a specific one. Let me go back and we can pull it up. So there's really two pivots you can use. One pivot is on the users. You say, hey, give me all the users app role assignments, which could potentially be a whole lot, right, if you got a ton of applications. Or you can go to the application and say, hey, application, give me all the users who are assigned, or give me all the principals who are assigned to roles within your application. And I'm actually kind of wondering, yeah, app role assigned too. It might be on the service principal. That might be why. So the app role assignment. So the assignment has to happen in a certain way. We can come back. We'll come back around to that one. So on this one, it says we recommend creating app role assignments through app role assigned to relationship of the resource instead of the assigned user. Now that's for assignment. We can also go to, we can go to like a list and take a look at that and see what the docs say for this one. So this was just a list. So I think for the purposes of listing assignments, we could probably just start here. My assumption would be that for most directories, you will have significantly more users than you will applications. So it seems to me that in terms of specificity, I would want to say, and based on what we'll have in b2c too, I have user 123 and they're trying to access app 456. Do they have any app roles? So maybe we start at the user, we get their app role assignments, and then we filter them based on, we filter them to an app, to a specific app ID anyway. Now there was one, during the assignment phase, we actually have to do a couple extra things to go and look to see, we have to get service principals and then do the assignment via the service principal of the underlying application. In fact, we had to do that over here in our runtime function. You'll notice we have to go find the service principal associated with that application. We go get the roles that are associated with that app, and then we go and check to see. We go and get the user request ID, app role assignments request. So that's probably the best thing for us to do here. And that's going to end up hanging off of the user object. Let me take this, I'll just take this path so we can go look at it. So that may actually end up being, I wonder if that ends up being one of these user functions instead, where we end up with get user app role assignments by application. And then let's put this here. So then we end up, just take these two, move them down here. Oh, I found out about this screencast mode thing. I think it's pretty cool. Tell me if it's annoying, because if it is, I won't use it. I end up doing a bunch on the keyboard, so I'm a little worried it's going to end up being really, really super obnoxious. So I wonder too, like this is going to end up being interesting. Get user app role assignments by application. So this will end up being, we have to figure out the best way to do that part of the user query, and then that path will be app role assignments, and then we'll need to pass in a filter. I don't know if we really go all the way down that route of like putting the entire filter in here, or if there's a better way to do that, to send in this query string of what that's going to be. Does that end up being in this route? Because I guess there's also a case where you'd want to get the users, all of the users' app role assignments without the filter, I suppose. But you do need to tell us that you've got an ID, right? All right, let me see here. Let me turn that off. You can change the screencast thing, but you can change like its size and stuff, but whatever, I'll do that later. So in this case, what's the best way to get what's the best way to get queries in here, right? Where, I mean, if we want to map to what they're doing, because it isn't really a general purpose API. It's essentially a mock with a different security context today, anyway. You know, theirs accepts GUIDs. Theirs also accepts, I believe. Let me go back. So I'll do users. I'll do my user thing here, and then app role assignments. It should work. I think it does. Yeah, it does. So it works either way. You either need a user ID or you need a GUID. So we would need to support all 4 of ours. Yeah, I am going to end up with a load of endpoints. I don't really know if I like that either. The Graph SDK, does it accept anything besides a user object ID? Well, I don't know what the Graph SDK accepts. So the Graph SDK, let's see, if I do Graph client users, what is it expecting? Let me go find the docs for this. iGraph service gets the request builder. So we just put a string in here. App role assignments request. I mean, it looks like an array indexer, but I don't want to make that assumption either, that it is an array. Or if it's translated into what ultimately goes and gets built. That's true. Maybe we don't care and we let the SDK deal with it. That's a good point. Maybe we don't have to really worry about it. Because if we can take anything with that SDK, then we just take whatever the user gives us and we roll with that. What is Karnak, Jeremy Knight? Let's see. Let me go look at the C# SDK. And we'll see what, let's see, users query. Everything uses me, which is super, super annoying. Oh, for showing the keys. Oh, cool, okay. I'll go check it out. Let's see. All of these use me, which is super, super annoying because I don't necessarily want me. So this is Teams Team ID. I don't know if the Teams endpoint will take a different one, but I guess we could always just go and test it. Because yeah, if it just takes whatever, then we can just pass it through. It doesn't really matter. Two styles of client. One uses a fluid interface to create the request. So this accesses an array index. For SDKs support a fluent style, collections of entities can be accessed using an array index. For template-based SDKs, it's sufficient to embed the item identifier in the path segment. For PowerShell identifies or paths. That kind of implies that collections of entities can be accessed using an array index. So I wonder if that just puts it in the path then when it ultimately builds it, or if I do have to use the, if I do actually have to use the user ID. Because we can definitely send through what they send. Although, actually, I don't know if we are going to be able to. Because the users... Okay. So a graph, or sorry, a B2C user, the field that we have to query to find them is different from their user ID itself, right? So let me get my, let me sign into Graph Explorer with my B2C account. So sign out, yeah. And then let's go aka.msge. I'll do a sign in. I'm going to change this path to do it the other way. So we're going to come here. I'm going to put this up here. We're just going to change this to my B2C tenant, JPDA B2C on Microsoft.com. Sign in, ping. Does not exist in tenant, delete me. Oh wait, I got the wrong one. Forgot an A. Okay, so we get signed in. Why does it keep redirecting me to this other one? I'm gonna try this one more time. So take this path, put it in another browser. We're gonna change the directory to be my B2C one. So all I'm doing is taking out common and replacing it with my JPA b2c.onmicrosoft.com. Sign in. Signed into Graph, and I should be with my. Okay, good. So this is my actual B2C account. So if we look at the users collection in a B2C thing, you'll notice that the users here tend to have very different properties than everybody else. So if I was to come in here and insert, like, so one of the accounts I've used is my Gmail account, and that's not going to be found because it has to be. Let's see, it'll be filter sign in names, I believe. EQ jdanderson@gmail.com. Let's see if that works. No, invalid filter. Okay, let me go pull up one of these users and we'll see. So if we go find, all right, if we go find the Gmail user, here's my user. So I've got a user ID, and let's go find exactly their thing that we need, because those B2C users are a little bit different. So actually, it might be in the user identities collection now. So here's my user. I'm just going to grab the ID so we can go take a look at one specifically. So users, and then we'll go look at this single user. Pull this up a little bit. So many banners. Let's pull this up. So this is my Gmail account. Blah, blah, blah. Nothing exciting here. Of course, it does show up in other mails. This is my actual UPN. And because we're not gonna know these UPNs because they're B2C UPNs, those UPNs are not gonna be available. So I believe we do have the user identities, and then we've got all the other junk here. So where is my sign-in names? And sign-in names is an array, I believe, Jeremy Knight. I believe you are correct. Let's see, where are my sign-in names? Please tell me they're not. Please tell me they're going to be available in here. Otherwise, I'm going to be up the creek without a paddle. So, wait a minute. Did I not use the right? Am I not looking at the right account? That's certainly possible because this is a GitHub account. I think I'm not using the right one. Okay, so we have to have the OID per bolt, and we need Ah, here we go. That's right. It's in the device, or it's in the user identities now. So that's where it's coming from. Is it's the sign-in type of email address, and it's in the issuer, of course, is your directory, and your issuer assigned ID is your email address. Sign-in names was back in Azure AD Graph v1. No, I'm good now. I think we're good. So now we can use sign-in type of email address, because the other sign-in types would be like username or whatever. So I think this will actually, now doing the graph query to filter on identities is going to be a little interesting, but that's never stopped us before. So I'm going to grab this one user, and let's try at a minimum. Let's see if we can at least do a select. We'll do a select ID. We'll do a select on identities. For somebody who does identity stuff all the time, I can never spell identities all the way correctly every time. So we got our ID, we've got our identities, and then if I want to find a specific user, we're going to do a filter, and this is the stuff that always gets me, is I'm never quite sure the best way to filter within an array in a graph query. So the filter would be on, let's see. Oh no! Please tell me I didn't delete that. Didn't delete my last query. No, I didn't. Okay. So we got select ID, identities, and then I want to do, let's see, Microsoft Graph query array. I want to query an array property. So if I want to do a filter, so that's given name. Let's see, what can we do with filter? Varies across them. That's not very that's not very encouraging. So I want to filter on a specific property in an array. Identities, any ID. Ah, okay. Good looking out, Bolt. That's awesome. So we'll do a dollar filter. So on the identities array, ID issuer. So let me look at that. Let me look at the any filter. Let's see. OData any filter. So any, let's see, actor's name EQ. Oh, okay, so that would be, so actually I guess we'll have a couple filters. So we'd end up with, we need a sign-in type of email address. I guess maybe that doesn't actually matter. We need the issuer assigned ID. So issuer assigned ID. And then, so it's essentially any on the collection and then the value you need, and then the normal OData query. Yeah, okay. So any let me start with this one. Issuer assigned ID EQ JPDA b2c test2 at mailinator.com. See if this one works first. Invalid filter. Okay, so I must have done something wrong. So any, so would that be, do I need the any first, or does the identities path need to exist first? Yeah, you're right. Let's do sign-in type first. Sign-in type EQ email address. But do I need this identities path? I guess so. Well, or would it be any and then identities slash, since that's the collection. Any actors and then the field. So the filter is any, okay, let me try that. filter is the entity. I feel like I'm like, oh, it's a, oops, sorry. It's a comma. So movies, $filter, any property name, or sorry, array name, property in array. So, and it's a comma. So that would be identities, sign-in type, EQ, email address. Why doesn't it like that? So identities, sign-in type, EQ, email address. If we look at this, on that path, we've got a filter, any. Let me see, Microsoft Graph, any filter. Any. If any parameter, okay, no. Support for filter, blah, blah, blah. The following logical operators are generally supported. So lambda operator any or all, okay. Contains is not supported on anything, whatever, that's fine. So then I wonder, does the Azure AD backing part of graph support that? I'm going to look at your query. I'm going to use your whole query bolt. Let's see what we get. So this is a filter. Okay, so I'm actually not in my thing. So, oh, I see what you're doing. I got it now. So the XX here is really just you're just essentially, it's a lambda function, right? So JPDA B2. Well, let me try this one. jadanderson@gmail.com. Okay. Oh, the specified filter against a single entity is invalid. So do I need to just maybe do it against the users collection? Unsupported property or property value or combination of property and operation occurred. Let me take the select out too, just for the purposes of simplicity. So identities any XX sign-in type is email address, and the issuer signed ID is equal to that. So you don't need the $ in front of filter on the beta endpoint, but I'm told. The V1 endpoint does still need them. So, so we're trying to do this filter on the identities. Unsupported property or property value. Get my notes up here, my sticky note. So I'm gonna put this query in here just for a minute so we can come back to it. So if I go get users, and yeah, I mean we're getting identities. So that's the sign-in type of email address and an issuer signed ID of Gmail. So then, I mean, how on earth do you actually get a user? Now, I guess on the other hand, though, well, yeah, because we're still going to have to search. We're going to have to search for a user. All right, we've got a GitHub issue. So this is not looking encouraging for me actually getting this done today. When filtering on identities, you must both supply the issuer and the issuer assigned ID. Oh, okay. So the issuer, in our case, is email. What is our issuer going to be? Our issuer is going to be our directory. So that would be an issuer that equals jpdab2c.onmicrosoft.com and an issuer assigned. This is well, so most of the code we're writing is in C#, but this specifically is OData. Or OData filtering is OData filtering. So look at that. So now I've got that, which is awesome. Thank you, Bolt. So email address, of course, is always going to come from the same issuer because you're a local account. So then we could also still do a select in here. And the select would just give us our ID and say our identities. So that's going to get us our specific user, which is great. Now I wonder, I don't think I can do this directly on a user, because I guess I really wouldn't want to do it directly on a user. So that's a 200 millisecond query. So, okay. So at least, now does this work in V1? Or do we have to use beta? No, okay. So we can do this in V1 too. So let's take this. Yeah, so social's going to be interesting because we're going to have to let people search by some kind of a field for that user. But this query is essentially get a user by username, because the sign-in type would be a little bit different. The sign-in type, I believe, is username. So that would be, I guess the other thing we would need in here is like a sign-in type, EQ, email address, and so if we run this, oh, interesting. So that, it doesn't seem to let us do that with sign-in type. Sign-in type, EQ, email address, and X issuer is ours, and X user assigned ID is that. It doesn't actually look like we can do just email address, which seems kind of strange. So X sign-in type, EQ, email address, and that's what we had. Why doesn't it like this? What's the squiggle? Okay, that makes sense. So the sign-in type is email address. And issuer signed ID. Interesting. Let me take this out for a minute. Make sure I didn't misspell something, because that's always a possibility. Now, so it's email address, and then the issuer, and it's sign-in type, right? That's what we had. So this is going to give us, well, I guess we could use the same search for essentially any local account, because the local accounts are going to be different sign-in types, right? That's amazing. See? I mean, think about how many times we've all re-implemented the same wheel 4 million times. So actually the sign-in type largely kind of doesn't matter, because the issuer for a local account is always going to be the directory, right? So if your phone number, if your username, or if your email, our query that we have still works, because we really need to look at the issuer and the issuer assigned ID. We could also, we could throw in an extra check to say like, hey, is this, is this of type email address or of type something else? But for social accounts, we'd either have to search on an alternate field, like if you say capture email addresses of social people, so you'd have to search on that field. Or you'd have to get like a name, we'd have to do like a display name search or something similar, because they're essentially going to be user property searches to find an extra user, because you're not going to know their object ID and their UPN, because their UPNs are completely kind of, it's a GUID. It's their object ID GUID. So for how do I make that bigger? Can you make sticky notes bigger? It doesn't look like it. Which seems to sort of go against the grain in terms of what a sticky note should be, but essentially, so I've got So username, or essentially local account, which is username, phone, or email, which is just it's just in the identities list. Identities list, and a local issuer. For social, we're going to have to search on XYZ property. Could be display name, could be a captured email, which would be other mails, or the other mails array. It could be a custom property. So a property that's a directory extension, essentially. Hey, Bruce Lane, how are you this morning or afternoon, whatever it might be. Whatever it might be for you. I'm trying to build. I gotta build something to do b2c authorization. So we're gonna port all the app role stuff in. So I gotta build the API for the admin part of it. And that's what I'm working on. And the admin part, we're going to try to mirror the graph as much as possible and be almost identical to what you would send into a graph. So that ideally you could switch to graph in the future. Although, now that I think about this, so right now, the way that you get a user out of Azure AD and the way that you get a specific user out of B2C are very different, especially when you're looking at like a UPN or email address type of a search or type of a lookup. But I wonder if it's valuable, I wonder if that's valuable to make the two be the same so that you interact with this the same way you would expect to. I mean, we'd have to have some logic in there to say, is this a B2C directory or not? And we'd go to generate a query. But ultimately, it would kind of give you like a single surface for both, which I think might actually be kind of neat. So, and we also, thanks to Bolt also confirmed, okay, cool, thank you. Bolt also confirmed that we have to use the ID here. So this is going to always require the ID. So if we're using the Graph SDK, which of course it's not really gonna matter because we're gonna have to do it ourselves anyway. So now we're back to the question of now we're back to the question of how much do we want to mirror, right? How much of the graph do we want to mirror in terms of the queries? Like, do we need to go figure out a full OData type of an engine that we want to use? And then, or do we just want to mimic what they've got or what we need for our portal to work and figure out do we do OData filtering, like actual proper OData parsing and filtering on our own later? I mean, ultimately, the app role assignments list is always going to be the list of roles you're assigned to, for example. I mean, that's essentially always going to be the same query because you need to filter it down to the resource. You need to filter it to the specific application, and since we're off the user entity and the user path, it'll always be by the user. Yeah, and I don't think we're actually going to end up in a place where we're doing like a full-blown pass-through Bolt. You know, like, I mean, because we're going to have to do things like we're going to have to tack on extra filters to filter by the user's organization or to filter by something else, at least for B2C. So I don't think we'll ever be at the point where we would necessarily pass through. It's more making the surface match what you would get in Azure AD, so that when we can do this in Graph natively. That we can do it in Graph natively. I'm going to use restroom because my teeth are kind of floating. So I'm going to use restroom. You guys can listen to the music for a minute since I know it's apparently super popular. Anyway, I'll be back in just a couple minutes. I'm going to ping Christos and see if he's awake yet. So BRB. Good morning.
Can I let you fly solo? Fly solo.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, it's funny. Everybody loves the music. And the funny thing is, so we spent like a whole day going through the music library trying to find stuff that we wanted to use, and we found that, and we found like 25 other ones, and we sent them to the people that made all the like graphics and stuff. And I guess they just picked the first one just as placeholder, and we all ended up liking it so much that we just kept it around. So
You did indeed.
at least we still got it. So anyway, so we are building essentially a graph facade. So most of our API methods are going to mimic the graph, so that one day we could ideally transition this over to graph. So now we're to the point where I actually do have I have to do a query, and I'm debating. Do we go sort of like whole hog on full? Oh God, no. On like an OData framework for parsing OData queries.
Wait,
Or
GraphQL?
well, no, I need it to mirror the graph, our graph. Like we want these queries to mirror the graph as much as possible, so that one day you could drop this function entirely and just use graph directly.
Sure. Okay.
And since our graph doesn't do GraphQL,
Well, it does OData, but it doesn't do full OData.
yeah. So if I'm looking for app role assignments, I need service principal ID.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to get back to principal resource. And then there's also going to be a filter on that, right?
Yes.
So, and it hangs off the user. So now it's like, do we take this whole path? You know, let me share my screen to you, because I know that you're going to see it delayed. And I learned last night that is pretty awful to watch somebody to watch it delayed. So let me get you my screen so you can see it.
65 shows, man. 65 shows.
I know. So, okay. Now you can see my screen.
Now I can see your screen.
And then move this over here. All right. So we have this, right? So we've got our resource. We have our resource filter, and I'm debating. This is Synthwave 84. I think we can.
We have a bang theme. I did it.
Yep. So it's such an interesting theme that in order to make the glow work, you have to correct the checksums on. You have to fix the checksums on. If I can think correctly, on VS Code afterward, because apparently it goes and makes some changes. So what could possibly go wrong?
We found yesterday that not everything supports bicep as well. So that was an interesting thing. Right, so where are we now? What do you need?
So this is essentially a way to get the user's app role assignments by an application ID. So coming out of b2c, we're going to have, well, sorry, this is the admin portal. So in the admin portal, a user's going to be, they're going to have a list of applications. Mm-hmm. And then, so they'll be able to get a whole list of apps that are assigned, that they have a specific membership role in it, right? That's a good point, according to Bo. We may have to put that in here somewhere. Like, what is it? Like, enhance your calm. So now I'm trying to figure out, like, well, for starters, can we even put in a root with a query string like that? Can I have a root defined that's literally just that, like including the entire query string? Like is the root parameter gonna take that and know what to do with it? I don't know.
That's a good question. Have you looked at the docs to see what kind of routing is supported in other functions?
Well, it says it's web API style, so.
Okay.
But web API supports OData. has OData packages and functions does not. So, short of doing Web API instead,
Yeah, I'm
or
surprised you
using some
decided
sort
to
of
go
OData
down
thing.
that route.
I see what you did there. Surprised I went down this route.
It was an unintentional pun. I like it.
I mean, in ideally, ideally, these functions are just sort of all they're going to do is pass it back to other classes, and those other classes could be part of. They could be Web API. In fact, you may find that doing this with functions just sucks, and it's not something we want to do.
Functionality, okay. I mean, there's only one way to find out, right? Just grab run one of them and see what you get into your body and into parameters if they get populated.
Yeah, thousands of comedians out of work, and this guy wants to be funny.
It is. That's how I make my living.
I'm going to take this user query here. I'm just going to return a new OK object with a new method, and I'll just call this, whatever, query by app and user. And let's send back so let's see, we're going to have the user query, and we're going to filter on the service principal ID, which is the application, ultimately the application ID. So we'll just call this service principal ID. And I'll see if we get these back. So user query and service principal ID. Okay. And we'll see what we get. I need a new OK object result. Okay. So let's run this, see what we get. I'm going to take this and we'll go run this over in Postman and see. Well, first let's see if any of these these functions actually resolve. Boom, boom, boom. So everything's blown up. Let's see. The literal section is invalid. Literal sections cannot contain the question mark character. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to do that anyway. Which, in some ways, that's actually okay, because it kind of forces us to deal with... It sort of forces us to deal with it anyway. So we'll have to get the query and deal with it on our own. Which is fine. Yep. But at least it means I can get on with what we're doing here. So
you will have to parse the query yourself.
Yeah, which I could find an OData library to do it for me, which would certainly be ideal. Or I could just pass whatever the OData query is back. I mean, we're actually going to have to generate an OData query anyway ourselves. Like these aren't going to pass directly through.
Yeah, you have to do some processing anyway.
Yeah, they're all ultimately going to be filtered by. They're all going to ultimately be filtered by the user's organization, the administrative user's organization. So,
morning, BSD guy. Morning, Sean. How are you doing, folks? Nice to have you here.
It's early. It's like what, 7:50 in the morning for you. Thanks for coming and hanging out so early.
You think about me or our friends?
Everybody, but you especially, because it's super early for you.
It's not super early. We used to do the show at 7 a.m. in the morning, remember?
No, I guess that's true. Well, but
that's how we name it 4:25, because it was too early.
Wait a minute. We're in standard time right now, right?
Yeah.
So in a week, we will spring forward. So in a week, this will actually be 11:53 my time and 8:53 your time.
Is that next week?
A week or two.
Wow. Already? Damn. That's fast.
March 8th. So a week from next week. The following weekend. It's a week after my birthday. I do wish that everybody would convert to UTC, and I agree with you, Bolt. I would have loved to have done app role assign, like, user query, app role assignment, whack, like application ID. because I think that makes a whole lot more sense. But you're right, it's not interchangeable with graph. I mean, we could always, I think once we get to the point of having graph interchangeability, we could always add convenience methods.
Yeah.
We could always accept a few different ones, right? Okay, so anyway, this is going to get us our app role assignments, and we're definitely going to have to deal with any incoming clauses. We'll just call these OData clauses. So that's going to get user app role assignments. Now we also need, so we've got organization users. So we can go get a user. We've got, so we have 3 methods to do that. One's a user ID, a GUID, one's an email, and then one is a catch-all. I think this actually may end up migrating to be more of like a search, because b2c users don't show up in the directory the same way that a regular Azure AD user does. So while I can put in my UPN at, put in my UPN into regular graph, and I know what my UPN is, the UPN that you get in b2c is not a human knowable UPN. It's just a GUID. Okay, so we have to get the user's app roles. We also need to get applications. Now, I've got these down here. And so I've got another list of essentially get applications. So this root is applications. And then we've got application ID. Forget a specific application. That seems to make sense. Get application roles. Now, the way that we get application roles today is, I believe, applications, app ID, app roles. But let's go back to the graph and check. So, and thank you again, Bolt, for, so let's see, applications, and then I'm pretty sure I've got one in here called, like, probably searching for b2c in here is not going to be the best way to find the one that I'm looking for. Let's see, I think it was called auth-z. Yeah, here we go, auth-z sample app. And then, does this have any app roles associated with it? It does. So, let's go get this. So I can get a specific application by ID, which we would expect, right? And then,
You can do forward slash app roles and will come up. No,
and then the
select, right?
And the next one is, oh no, I believe it is a property that hangs off of it, and it is. So we can get our app roles that way too.
Sweet.
So this app roles one is good. We'll just put a comment here so that we can have a real one to go look at. So this is applications, app roles. And then if we want to get a specific one, we can go, I believe we can go get one by the specific app role ID. So let's go take this. And then app roles / app role ID. Oh, we can't do that. So this is app roles. So then we have to do another filter here. So this ends up being on the app itself, and then we end up doing essentially the same thing, right?
So what are you trying to do, and you have to do a filter?
I want to get a specific app role by ID.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So that's going to end up being, where'd my sticky notes go?
Oh, you said that you had the filter the other way around. I didn't see that. Can you try to do it now?
Well, no, well, I didn't have it before. So,
okay.
Okay, so this ends up being, let me get my
Good catch, Bolt.
So this is going to essentially follow a very similar pattern where we're going to filter app roles, and then we'll do
select.
I won't do a select, so we'll do app roles any, and then we'll do a lambda. So app roles any, and then XX ID EQ. I don't know if this is EDM GUID or EDM string, so we will find out momentarily. Thanks for all the help, Bolt, and enjoy your team meeting. And we'll see you on I guess we'll see you
See you
on
tomorrow.
Friday.
Yeah.
Wait, what's today?
Thursday.
Oh my God, I can't believe it's already Thursday. Okay.
This week is gone, my friend. It
I
came
know.
and went. Came and went.
Some days I just give up. So, okay. So we're going to filter on app roles, any x to ID EQ, and it looks like this is a string. It is not of type EDM GUID. So we'll do a filter here, run, invalid filter. Let me check the one. That we had earlier. So it's any. Let's see. So that's on the users thing, and then we're gonna filter to app role. So this is on the application object itself. We're gonna filter
Wait,
to app roles.
that's super tiny. We can't see what you're doing.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
what you're
No,
saying.
I can't zoom this part in. Sadly,
Oh, really?
I can't.
Really?
Yeah, you can't zoom in sticky notes, so far as I can tell. So
What?
identity. So we've got app roles any. And then X into X ID EQ. And if we look at this, it's X. So it's the thing you're searching on, the collection you're searching on, and then any. So the filter is any.
Remember,
role
it
ID.
may not be supported, right? There's a good chance that it might not be supported.
Well, usually, and I'm saying that somewhat facetiously, but usually it tells you if it's not supported.
Nope. I came across this one and I had to speak to Daryl about it. He was like, oh yeah, this one is not supporting what you're trying to do. Beautiful.
So I can't get a specific app role. Surely I should be able to. So it's X to XID, EQ,
Okay, so
and then
think about it. What are the chances of you getting everything and then just filtering in code? Is there a chance that we'll have hundreds of app roles?
It's certainly
app?
possible.
And even
I
so, is that going to be a slow query?
Don't know, maybe. So let's see. So this is on the user's property or the user's object. And then my filtering on the identities array. It's any X issuer. So our applications query is it's on a specific object. That shouldn't matter though. And then we're filtering to app roles any XXID EQ and then a string. So that all looks
Looks
as
okay.
expected.
Yeah.
So I wonder if this does require beta, because I think some of these newer ones may
I
require
was just going to
that.
mention
Maybe
it.
not.
I wonder if you need a beta. Nope.
We'll take the application ID out for just a minute. Nope. Invalid filter. Okay. And it is, let's see, app roles any. Wait a minute. EQ and then our string, and then close paren. So app roles any. Position 25 and app roles any. I guess it's because it's not because it's a string. So.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to put a note in here and we'll come back to it. So if I need to get
there's a workaround for
specific
now. You
role-
don't have to sweat it. There's a workaround.
So it's still the same path, although this path is not going to work. It's going to have to be applications, app ID, app role. And since we cannot give it an application ID directly, since that's not going to work, at least to maintain the sort of backward compatibility with graph,
Yep.
we'll just have to we'll ultimately end up having to take in a specific role. We'll have to deal with the query. So that's okay. We'll figure it out. So that's not going to be there. This is essentially going to look like the other one for now. So I'll just comment it out. So this will give us our app role list, which we're going to need for users to. Users are going to have to search for an application, and then they're going to want to see all the roles that are available for that app, and then they're going to want to assign users into that role, and see users who are already in that role.
Okay.
Now, in order to do that, that's going to be the inverse of what we had before. So in this case, we end up with, let's see here. So we've got our application, and I believe, now these may have to be done. Let's see, is it app role assigned to? These may have to be done on the service principal, not on the application directly, which would be kind of a pain, but if it was easy, somebody would have already done it, I guess. So
I like that. I like that. If it was someone who would have done it.
So let's see. This is a list of app role assignments that have been granted to a service principal, which we actually don't want. We want the other direction. The app role assigned to relationship with a resource. So app role assigned to. So what this gives us is our, but I believe app role assigned to only exists on the service principal itself, because the service principal, of course, is the thing that actually does that's the actual principal, right? So what that means is, if we want to see all of the users who are assigned to a specific app role, what we'd end up having to do is we have to resolve the application to a service principal, and then take that service principal ID and use that to run that query.
Right.
So if we look at, so if we got this application, if we go and get this application's, we need to go find the service principal that's associated with it. So that ends up being service principals, and then we'll do another query on here, and we'll filter where app ID EQ. App ID EQ, the app ID. Should give us a service principal. So now we have the service principal. So now we can take the service principal's ID, and we can go get the. We can take the service principal ID and use that to go get the app role assigned to. So service principals, that should give us the same service principal, and it does. And then in here, this is where we have the app role assigned to. And then we get everyone who's assigned to it. So we see that this user's assigned the principal's display name. Of course, we get the principal ID, but this is all for the same application, right? So this is essentially our list. So what that means is that when we want to get all of the application role assignments, what we actually have to do is we have to resolve an app ID to a service principal ID, and then we go and run app role assigned to hanging off of it.
Yeah. So a little bit of pre-processing before you get the data.
What are you talking about, AZ Wildfire? That looks like
Snick.
spam.
No, Snick that I always.
No, I know. I'm just saying that
Ah.
the way his message is worded, I thought it's a account got hacked.
He's a spammy friend, so it's okay. We love him for that.
I don't like
Got a
the
good
look of
idea.
it.
I don't know. It looks a little suspect from here. Okay. So we want to get all the application role assignments. This is, of course, by the application ID. So that's helpful. So then the last thing we need to do is to actually add an application role assignment. And to do the role assignment, we are going to use the same. Essentially, we're going to use the same thing. So the doc specifically says for a service principal, but
Yep.
we don't actually care about that, about the fact that it is for a service principal, because we just need a principal ID.
Yep.
So we end up posting that to the app role assigned to the same way that we do the other one. So we end up doing kind of the same work. Oops. So we still have to do the same thing. We have to resolve the app ID. Now, because we want to maintain this sort of level of compatibility with Graph. No, you're right, BSD guy, but I just don't know how to pronounce SUS. Is it just sus?
Sus?
Is it just sus? We should do it among us. We should do it among us on stream someday. I played it with AZ Wildfire and some other guys. It was a ton of fun. I was like, this is actually surprisingly exciting.
And it's surprising to hear that because I was not invited. It's fine. It's fine.
Well,
you and your friend AZ Wildfire are doing it.
I'll be
It's okay.
quite honest. You probably wouldn't have wanted to come.
Why not?
Well, just because it's a bunch of people I used to work with on my old team.
It's fine.
So
I can
they
dabble
were-
with AZ Wildfire and you.
and some of them are just completely inappropriate, just like AZ Wildfire, but worse. AZ Wildfire at least is constantly optimistic.
AZ Wildfire needs to come to the show and tell us how he managed to get that 5G hotspot for his house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing that we need to implement then is we actually need to have we need to have this intermediary here. So we need to do a get service principal ID by application ID.
Is that need to be exposed or should that be a private one?
You know, that's a good question. Does the front end actually doesn't care about that? So yeah, it doesn't need to be exposed. That's a good point. So, well, but
You mean as a user you might need to call that first before you call your assignment endpoint?
yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Although we should have enough data that you should be able to make that call.
Directly. And internally we'll resolve everything.
So when we get the app role assignments, we're going to be, yeah, like on the one hand, there's, yeah. So on the one side, it's like, do we fill in the gaps or do we work with what we have so that we can reuse it later? And I think we work with what we have so we can fill it in later, instead of trying to fill in gaps with new graph methods that don't exist. You know what I mean? Because that seems like it'd be that feels A, futile, and B, like a generally bad idea. Although this may be a good opportunity to say, hey, maybe we should have some like these are the kinds of things people need to do. Maybe we should have some better things in there. So, okay.
Like people need to do, you mean I need to do?
I mean, all sorts of people need to manage role assignments. Think about all the
True.
think about all the software out there that is specifically for managing all your stuff, you know? So, okay, so that's the thing, right? Like, so then this applications path to add a new one, like this doesn't exist anymore. This becomes service principals, and it becomes the service principal ID, and it becomes what was that? App role assigned to. And so then we end up with app role assigned to. So this is service principal ID.
So this will be a post, right? Yeah.
Yep. So this will be a post. And then there'll be a bunch of data in the payload that says what it is, right? Just return a new one here with the service principal ID, just for now, because who cares? So when we add an application role assignment, we're going to add it the same way we would add it normally. I guess it's just like, do we abstract the complexity away from the downstream app, from the client app, to go and do the resolution, and then send it? Essentially, we're going to expect a proper service principal to come in. We're going to expect a service principal ID, not an application ID. So then it's just a matter of does the API need to expose the way to do that resolution, since we're going to have to do it anyway. I mean, if we are building a proxy, right? So essentially, I believe, getting the app role assignments ends up being the same thing. Only it's a get instead of a post. Because you're going to get the app role assigned to, and that's going to give you all of the app role assignments for a specific application. And then you're going to post the same. You're going to post in a three object JSON object to do the rest. And then the last one is going to be actually creating a net new app role. So let's see, app roles. That's not an app. We don't want an assignment. We need to actually create an app role. So let's create an app role. That's in here somewhere. All right, let's see, create app role with graph. The app role resource type, here we go. So we update the application, right? So we're going to do a post on the application itself, or a patch actually, I believe. We're going to do a patch on the app. So we're still going to need the app ID to do that. And then it'll be available on all tenants. Of course, this isn't multi-tenant, so it doesn't really matter. But so we'll update the application itself to add these. So that's just going to be a patch on the application itself. So we'll do a patch applications whack ID. So this is just, so we don't need the post. And then we just need applications whack ID. Okay, get rid of all this. Actually, because we are sort of maintaining this, I wonder if I should use the graph objects or not. We talked about this a little bit ago, but okay, so we've got our add application role. That's going to let us create new app roles, which is cool. So I think so at this point, if I'm thinking through what these users are going to have to do, we get back to our diagram. So we think back to what these users have to do. A user's got to come in, they've got to search for, or they've got to see the applications for which they are in a specific role.
Right.
They have to be able to create net new app roles. They have to be able to search for users, and then they have to be able to assign those users to those app roles. And everything is filtered within the context of an organization. So, yeah, so I think that's good. I think we're good to go there.
Nice.
They should be able to do all of those things with this. All of those things should be attainable by doing this. Now, the other big thing I got to figure out is every single one of these needs to be filtered by organization. And I looked, and there was an iFunction invocation filter that was available, but it was never out of preview. It doesn't sound like it's actually going to get used, which is kind of lame. It sounds like they're going to do something totally different instead.
Okay.
So I'm trying to figure out like a good way to filter these. I'm almost tempted to just do it in a repository and just have an user filtered repository that just handles all that for you. Because if we were to go build like a full super admin API separately, we could just use the same repository with the same repository with no user filtering on it. So that if you're the SaaS provider, your admins could go in and see everything for everybody. I mean, you could also just go and do that in the Azure portal too. So maybe it's not that big of a deal. But that's probably the next big problem I got to figure out is every single one of these methods essentially is going to have to be filtered to a specific user.
User organization.
To the organizations of a specific user. Most users are only going to have one organization, but there's always a possibility a user is an admin of multiple organizations.
Right.
Oh, sorry, not an admin of multiple organizations, a member of multiple organizations.
Which means
their ability.
Yeah.
their ability to do any of this work in terms of assigning users or creating
Your roles.
assigning users or creating roles, all that's going to be driven by their membership in a specific app or in a specific app role for their application. So if I've got like 15 apps, every app is going to have an app role on it called application administrator or whatever. You can call it whatever you want. Your user, a user who goes to this portal, their ability to do anything is going to be driven by membership within that role. So they're really, I guess, really two big filters is A, are you authorized to do this at all by virtue of being a member of this group? And B, are you, what do we filter the result set down to? So like every user query is going to have to be filtered to a specific organization. Every application query is going to have to be filtered to a specific organization and to a specific set of applications for which you are the app.
So that will need to be passed in as part of the query every time.
Well, we're going to have the user principal, so the principals, I think we'll drive it off of the user principal as opposed to in the query. But then, in the graph query that has to go, in the graph query that goes off of this, like when this thing goes and actually does that, AZ Wildfire, I swear it's always something new. You haven't muted us yet today, have you?
Why do you have to remind him?
Because I wasn't sure if it had happened and I just totally missed it.
No,
Although
it hasn't happened.
I noticed yesterday and I noticed today that my OBS has got a really weird thing going on. So yesterday it took forever for it to start.
Ooh.
So anyway,
I'm telling you, you need to rebuild your machine. Something is iffy there.
I just rebuilt it, like in December. It's because I got some Windows update. I think I don't know what it is. Like the CPU usage isn't high, but it acts like it is. So anyway, yeah. So I think this is it for now because I got to go do a bunch of other work now and go to meetings. But yeah, at least now I've got what I need in terms of the API surface. Now it's just a matter of filling it in. So this project's out. It's out in GitHub. So if you're feeling bored, you want to contribute, by all means, please go. But yeah, I think I got to go do some other work when we get out of here for a little bit. But should we go raid somebody?
Yes, please.
Any raid requests?
We got Visual Studio, 165 people right now. Let's see what they're doing.
What are they doing first? Let's go see first.
Yeah, let's go see.
If it's boring or
Focus
lame.
on, it's the .NET Conf today, man. You forgot about that. We got .NET Conf today. And there is a session on identity. We got Javier Lozano doing one around Windows desktop apps with Azure AD.
I thought there was just a .NET Conf a few months ago.
They do every 3 months now, and it's called Focus on something, and they're focusing on a specific technology. Oh, it's the keynote.
Oh.
With Mr. Hunter.
Well, I guess we should go rate it then. Even though they're not even going to know that it got rated. Well, I hope you guys are interested in building WPF on .NET 5 because it looks like that's where we're going. I mean, if there's any other requests, if anybody's got a request, please let me know. We'll go raid somebody else. I love how the first thing I see here is can we run it on XP?
Lana is live as well. Lana Lux.
So is it so .NET Desktop or Game Dev? You guys tell me. Where do you want to go? Game Dev or .NET? And that reminds me, I need to respond to. So Game Dev or .NET 5? You tell me. What's new in WPF? This must be like a time machine. Is WPF still a thing?
They got hot reload.
If you're building a .NET Desktop app, I want you to tweet me and tell me you are. Because I need to build one, and I could use some help figuring out which one of the 9,000 different desktop frameworks I could use to build a .NET.
Actually,
this guy, Dimitri, he was the one who replied to me. It took 3 tweets to explain what to do with desktop apps, and I still don't know. I'm much closer to knowing, but all right, we'll go over to Visual Studio. All right, everybody, we'll be back tomorrow morning with
our friend
Sebastian.
Sebastian. We're doing Kotlin tomorrow with Android.
Yeah, he's going to teach us how to use Kotlin. He's going to teach C# people how to write Kotlin. So I think it'll be kind of interesting. I'm sort of excited. So I've got IntelliJ and I'm ready to go. And I think it's going to be kind of fun. And then next week on Monday, we got a special show on Monday because Monday we have Claire Novotny coming from .NET Foundation, and I guess she works at Microsoft now too. We've got her coming to talk. She's to talk about sort of the state of the .NET ecosystem and all sort of fun stuff. And we're going to pepper her with a bunch of questions about .NET. So feel free to send us your questions.
You can ask her about WPF and desktop.
Yeah, ask her about WPF and desktop, and if that's, do I still need to install Visual Studio 2005 for that to work, or like how does that? Anyway, she'll be here on Monday, which is gonna be a little bit different from normal. Tuesday is Ignite kickoff, so Tuesday we're gonna have a watch party of the keynote.
No MS Learn, no Learn module, but we're doing the live commentary.
Yep, no Learn module, but if you want to come hang out and watch the keynote with us, and we might find a few other cool identity sessions to stream. Come hang out with us. As always, join us in the Discord. There's always good conversation out there, and there's always some good, interesting stuff to do. So come join us in Discord, and we will see everybody in about 12 hours, 11 and a half hours.
It's not 24 hours? No, 24 hours.
24, sorry, 23 and a half, sorry. Yeah, you're right. All right, see everybody. Have a great day.
See everyone. Bye.
Bye. I guess we're all getting ready to go raid, so see ya.